Devastation, Extremism, Mayhem, Existential Dread, Chronic Backbane. These are just some of the threats that your player characters might face as they brave the stories that you have constructed. Oh, what's that? Oh, some of those are just what I've been experiencing since returning to full-time employment. Fair enough. Today, we're going to talk about threats in adventure design on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who understands the fine art of threatening his players. What? It's adventure design. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. And welcome back to Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, a series where we take a look at the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers to help us run Pathfinder 2e more effectively at our gaming tables. This is a series designed for storytellers of all skill levels, from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not your preferred system, I invite you to stick around and be a part of the conversation. Studying a variety of games often gives us great ideas that we can bring back to our own game. So, regardless of what you play or how long you've been playing it, I hope that this conversation is beneficial to you. Today, we're taking a look at the second major element that Paizo discusses in adventure design as part of the larger conversation around campaign design for game masters. I'm sure that was clear as mud, so stepping back a bit, we've been taking a look at the big picture top-down campaign design structure that Paizo recommends for storytellers who are trying to plan out their next game. Paizo's structure begins with the broad strokes of campaign structure, moves down to adventure design, and then finally focuses on encounter design. Now, we've looked at the broad strokes of campaign structure, and in the previous video, we discussed the first element of adventure design, which is adventure style or recipes, and the different ingredients that were part of that. Today, we're looking at the second major element of adventure design, which is threats. What is the danger that your party is going up against? So today we're going to discuss 5 different types of threats that Paizo recommends using in your adventure design, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you might use those threats and what the difference is between a threat and a monster. By the way, the material from today's video is discussed on pages 43 and 44 of the Gamemastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so if you want to do some more detailed reading on the subject, you can go check that out. And before we dive in, let me just remind you of all the YouTube stuff real quick. Please remember to like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and you can check out my free Discord or my Patreon, both of which are linked in the video description. But with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Alright, so today we're talking about the second major element of adventure design, which is the threat that your party faces. And the first thing that I want to clarify in this conversation is threat and monster are 2 different things. The threat that the players face is not the specific enemy that the players are fighting. One of the most important things that Paizo says on the subject of threats is that the enemies and monsters that your PCs face represent something. Monsters mean something beyond just the stats that they have on paper. When you are designing an adventure, your player characters are going to have some kind of problem, some kind of issue, some kind of threat that they are dealing with and that they need to overcome. But when we talk about adventure design, which is the middle point in the three-tiered structure that Paizo gives us, we have to remember we're not picking out the specific details. When you think about picking a specific monster, when you think about designing a specific NPC, that's actually in the encounter design level, which we're going to talk about in future videos. Right now, we're at that middle tier, the adventure design, the story arc, if you will. And when we discuss threats in story arcs, we're not discussing individual monsters, but rather the dangers that a monster, that an NPC, that an organization might represent. Yes, your PCs will be facing off against other creatures, but what are the consequences of losing the battle against those creatures? That's what we're talking about today. As a storyteller, you want your enemies, your monsters, your NPCs to represent something, to represent a sort of threat that if your players lose, there's going to be some consequences inside of the story. Now, admittedly, this concept of threat that Paizo uses is a little bit vague. And as a result, it will take some time and some practice as a storyteller getting used to the idea of asking the question, what do my villains, my monsters, represent inside my story? But Paizo does a good job of giving us 5 different types of threats that you can use as a model or a baseline in understanding how to develop a threat for the adventure that you're writing. In specific, Paizo gives us corruption, devastation, extremism, mayhem, and subjugation as examples of threats that players may have to deal with over the course of a particular story arc. So, let's dive into those and talk about what they mean and how they impact adventure design for us as game masters. Now, the first threat that Paizo gives us is the threat of corruption. And the idea behind corruption is that a group of people, a group of enemies, are seeking to corrupt something. They're seeking to take something that was once good, once wholesome, once valued in a community or a society, and they want to twist it or pervert it and either add something to it that never should have been there or wholly corrupt what that particular thing is doing inside of society. By the way, as we discuss these different threats, this is a good picture to help us understand what a threat is. There is a danger to your PCs. They stand to lose something. Something bad is going to happen if they do not act. And in the case of corruption, you get the idea that something that is important to your PCs might be weakened, lost, or even turned against them if they do not act to prevent the corruption. Now, corruption can obviously cover a wide swath of different possibilities. Everything from the undead corrupting the natural environment to a corrupt judge or politician turning a political organization to their own evil benefit, all of those are examples of corruption as a threat that your player characters might have to deal with. Now, one of the cool things that Paizo does in discussing the different threats is they give us different examples of the types of creatures that might represent such threats. In the case of corruption, Paizo lists different types of aberrations, different fiends, the undead, as the sort of creatures that would represent a corruption of something that your PCs would value, and so they are very naturally going to push back against those creatures to protect the thing that they love. Hopefully you can see from this example that the idea of a threat should be something that's very engaging to your players because they are naturally going to respond to the danger that the threat represents. They love something, they care about something, they see the value in something, and when someone or something comes along and threatens to corrupt what they love, your PCs will naturally be driven to act. The next sort of threat that Paizo discusses is devastation, when someone or something moves into an area with the intent to destroy. That's what they're up to. This is the dragon that is going to burn down Lake Town. This is the invading army that is going to leave no survivors. The idea behind devastation as a threat is if this creature is not stopped, everything is gone. There is a real and existential threat to your player characters and to the things that they love because something has decided that they shouldn't exist anymore. I think when you peel back the idea of devastation as a threat to your PCs, what you're really looking at is the idea of cruelty or hatred. Stories have conflict, and conflict occurs in the world all the time, but there is a degree of conflict that is naturally unsettling, and it's the degree of conflict that occurs when devastation is the logical result. When someone hates something so much that they want to see it eradicated, that's when true destruction becomes possible. These kinds of stories work really well with the BBEG, the big bad evil guy who just wants to crush his enemies underneath his feet, and the personal stakes to your PCs will naturally motivate them to engage with the story. There's also a lot of tension with this kind of threat because if the PCs fail, even if they survive, there's nothing left for them to come back to. A third type of threat that Paizo discusses in adventure design is extremism. And this is a very society-based kind of threat. When we talk about devastation, we talk about the sort of situation where there is nothing left to return to. Extremism is different. You know that if the extremists win, there's still going to be a society. There is still going to be something there. But what exists in the wake of the extremist is something that your player characters are naturally going to be averse to seeing happen. Extremism as a threat is all about the fear of change. There are lots of good ideas in this world, but almost any idea driven to an extreme has the potential to become harmful. And sometimes the most dangerous villains are the ones driven by theoretically the purest of ideals. Extremism takes what might be a logical or helpful idea in a community and pushes it to something that is dangerous and damaging and that player characters naturally will want to push against. Extremism as a threat bears a lot of similarity to corruption that we discussed earlier, but I think the social nature of a lot of the ideas behind extremism and a lot of the social psychology that goes into extremism is what makes this threat distinct enough that you might consider using it as a storyteller. Now, if you can't tell from this conversation, corruption, devastation, extremism, even the other two topics we're about to talk about, as a storyteller, you want to be wise to what your players are comfortable with, and extremism is one of those elements where you want to make sure that you're getting the dosage right on what you're including in the story. But when we talk about extremism as a threat, essentially what we're talking about is the fear or danger that comes with extreme societal change. The next sort of threat that Paizo discusses is a little less personal than some of the other threats we've mentioned previously, and that is the threat of mayhem, or as Paizo describes it, mindless violence. Not every threat that your player characters come against is going to be something that is necessarily out to get them, or necessarily out to ruin something that they care about. Sometimes a threat just is there. An injured or diseased animal that lashes out without regard to who's around it is essentially committing mindless violence. The danger is real, but it's not directed at anything in particular. Natural disasters can threaten a community with no real ill will towards the community that stands to be devastated. Mayhem as a threat is the kind of story where player characters are caught up in a situation that is dangerous and maybe kind of outside the scale of what they're used to dealing with. It's not personal, but if they can't figure out how to get out of the way or divert the danger, they stand to suffer very real loss as they're caught in the area of effect for whatever mindless violence is occurring. Mayhem and devastation may have very similar after effects, but the threat of mayhem and devastation are very different. Devastation is personal and desires to see something ended. Mayhem really doesn't care what's there and really doesn't care what happens when it leaves the vicinity. The final threat that Paizo discusses in this section is the threat of subjugation. The idea that someone or something is moving into an area with a desire to control that area. Maybe they want to control the resources, maybe they want to control the people, maybe they want to control everything. But the point is, someone or something has decided that they must be in charge, and they don't care who they have to roll over in order to get that control. Subjugation as a threat really is an exploration of the fear associated with the loss of freedom. The idea that if a particular enemy, if a particular group is successful, that the player characters, should they survive, will find themselves restricted, losing freedoms, losing the ability to do something that they love or enjoy. Loss of control is a very real fear, and subjugation as a threat uses that fear to help hook players and to drive them to respond to whatever is happening. Now, as you can see, all of these threats are different. But there are a few takeaways that are worth noting when it comes to adventure design and what these threats mean to us as game masters. One of the things that I think is worth discussing is a threat is temporary. The threat of devastation from a war naturally ends when that war draws to a close. The threat of destruction from a natural disaster, again, once that natural disaster is over, the community is theoretically safe. Even when you deal with issues like corruption and extremism and subjugation, once the villain of that story is thwarted, the threat of those things goes away, at least for a time. And I think that's one of the important things to understand about adventure design. When you are including these threats, they serve as a motivation for players to act and to do and to respond to what's going on in the world. But it is worth noting that part of making a meaningful threat is giving your players a meaningful opportunity to overcome that threat, at least in the short term. If the cultists have been thwarted, then the leadership of this town is safe. Sure, the cultists may show up in another town later on in the campaign, but for the moment, that threat has passed, and there should be a sense of victory and accomplishment for your players. Threat naturally hooks your player into whatever the story beat might be, but also gives your players a chance to have the joy, the thrill of victory when that threat is overcome. It's also worth noting here that a good understanding of the threat of a story arc is going to help give you a lot of inspiration for the specific enemies, monsters, and NPCs that you will design during the encounter design portion of campaign creation. If I want my players to deal with the threat of mayhem, it's time to drop a tornado and some T-Rexes in the middle of town. By the same token, if corruption is the threat that I'm trying to drive home to my players, then a horde of zombies threatening to destroy the Druid's Grove will be the more logical choice. Having a good understanding of the threat of your story will naturally lead you to the specific mechanical options or monsters to portray that threat to your players. But that's all I've got for today's video. So it's time to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about adventure design and about this somewhat vague concept of threats? Are there other types of threats beyond the 5 that Paizo gave us that you think are good building blocks for an adventure or for a story arc? Let me know in the comments down below, and let me know which of the threats that we did discuss are some of your favorites to see and to use. Also, if you have any good tips or tricks for making use of threats in adventure design, feel free to leave those as well. Don't forget all of the other YouTube stuff. Like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out my free Discord and my Patreon. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.